Hey everyone, Joshua Kirk here with you once again, and I'm going to take a little break from my album reviews for this video. Since we're halfway through the year and we're sort of in the light of several half-year wrap-up best of lists, I'm going to talk about my top 16 favorite records of 2018 so far. Now, this is a list that I created about a week ago, so it kind of changed slightly since then, since there are kind of a couple more records that I discovered that I really liked that would have totally made it onto this list, but right now we're just doing the 16 albums that I have here on this list for this video. So anyway, let's get started. Starting with number 16, Dr. Dog, Critical Equation. You may remember I reviewed this album a little while ago. Definitely Dr. Dog's most accessible record to date, but definitely one of their most compelling. Here they really come out of their comfort zone as they worked with Gus Seifert, who produced the record, to create definitely by far their most polished record to date. But they are still like masters of incredible hooks. They've really matured significantly as songwriters, and they really still have the ability to try out new, fresh ideas as a band, making this by far their most masterful record since 2013's B-Room. Next, number 15, Courtney Marie Andrews, May Your Kindness Remain. This is definitely a country album, but it's so much more than that as well. It also blends together with country elements of pop, indie, and soul as well, and you pair that with a very beautiful, very kind of with a very beautiful voice, very touching lyrics, as well as some organic production that doesn't have any digital adornment, just the way any quality country album should be recorded. I mean, this is my first time really listening to her, but I'm definitely glad that I did, and I totally see why some critics just love her. Number 14, Courtney Barnett, Tell Me How You Really Feel. I mean, I was not expecting Barnett to wow me as much as she did with her latest album. I mean, she definitely did put out by far the highest reviewed indie rock album of 2015 with her debut, but I personally wasn't really that impressed with it. But however, the sophomore record really does see her improving on all fronts. I mean, it's a little more straightforward, less witty and rambling, but it still definitely has plenty of clever lyrical curveballs that leave quite an impression on me. And her vocal performances sound much better on this album, a lot more tolerable in my opinion, because I think her rambling delivery was just a little too much for me, so I think this time she's a lot more self-aware, and I definitely relate to the songs more on this album. There's still plenty of nuance and power to the guitar riff. There's definitely some very memorable, catchy riffs on this album. And also I gotta give her props for bringing in Kim and Kelly Deal as guests on this album. Number 13, Jon Hopkins, Singularity. This is definitely one of my favorite electronic records of the year. I mean, there's just so much beauty and nuance to the production. I mean, it's definitely very complex. Electronic music out of the UK. These pieces are these kind of elongated journeys of sound, and I definitely do And I definitely can't help but really gravitate towards these pieces. I mean his very kind of beautiful, very kind of gentle on the ears music definitely takes a little patience, but it's really lovely what he's produced here. And I also love his ability to blend in elements of classical and choral music on this album as well. I mean, there's one track in particular where he does a really good job sort of blending in the kind of emotional sound of a choir. Number 12, Jeff Rosenstock, Post. The first album released in 2018, as this was released on New Year's Day, but definitely one of the best punk albums of the year thus far. Jeff Rosenstock definitely continues to be probably one of the most consistent punk rockers of this decade. He does come out with his most accessible album to date, but still, nonetheless, it definitely has plenty of surprises, including two of his longest compositions to date, which are both the opening and closing tracks of the album. As well as bringing in a lot more guests than ever before. I mean, you have people like Laura Stevenson, Chris Farron, and Pup providing backup vocals for this album, and really sounding amazing on this album. As well as 9 out of 10, which is probably the least punk song I've heard from Jeff thus far, but still definitely one of his best compositions, because his lyrical content is just so self-deprecating on that track. It's definitely a great sort of step forward for Jeff as a lyricist. Yeah. Number 11, J. Cole, K.O.D. For a short amount of time, I would say this was my favorite hip-hop album of the year. That is until hearing the new Pusha T record, Daytona, and kind of that album sort of replaced that. So yeah, I made this list before I heard that album, so that's why it's not on here, but still, new Pusha T album is pretty banging. Check it out. Anyway, J. Cole comes out with an album that, if you want to find a rap album with a whole bunch of features on it, definitely look away now. But if you're one of those people who likes to hear a rapper just purely express themselves from the heart, definitely check out K.O.D. by J. Cole. Not only are the beats and samples really cool, he samples some really cool jazz records on this album, but also I think lyrically he's definitely progressed. I mean, I haven't really heard his other stuff. I'm gonna have to check it out sometime, but I think he does come through with some very kind of poetic, sort of smart vignettes. I mean, he's no Kendrick Lamar, but he definitely does. But he definitely has plenty of very interesting things to say. Things to say that unfortunately a lot of so-called rap stars you hear on the radio just don't have. Number 10, Amen Dunes, Freedom. This album is definitely the kind of album where, if you wanted to just kind of roll down your windows and drive out in the desert, this would be a perfect album to play in that situation. But it's also a record that I highly recommend listening to in those kind of introspective moments, because Amen Dunes, I can't remember his real name right now. He comes through with by far some of his most personal songs to date. I haven't heard his old stuff yet, once again with this artist, but I love how this album is very beautiful, haunting, funky, it's sexy, introspective, and nuanced all-in-one single record. I mean, some very cool guitar sounds going on here. I mean, War on Drugs fans definitely, I think, are gonna really dig this album as well. This album, as well as songs such as "L.A." that sort of go for this kind of very kind of groovy grindcore sort of thing. And the album also has the ability to incorporate some kind of unusual instruments. Yeah, and I love how he creates all these interesting little characters on this album without making anything too conceptual or anything that's like hard to comprehend or anything like that. It's a great record. Highly recommend it. And a lot of critics seem to be loving it, but it still sort of seems a bit under the radar, so I definitely would love to see this album sort of get a little more credit than it already does right now. Number 9, Young Fathers, Cocoa Sugar. I did review this album as well. It's definitely one of the most sort of interesting, kind of genre-bending albums of the year. At first I kind of thought of this band as maybe a hip-hop band, but upon spending time with Cocoa Sugar, this new album, I really found that the band had a lot more sort of genres sort of thrown into the pot. It's not just hip-hop, but you have gospel, punk, and industrial, and you also have like psychedelia as well. It's definitely a very it's definitely an album that has the ability to blend together all these different genres, but make it sound just very cool and very exciting. But they've also come out with their most accessible, streamlined record to date. They signed with Ninja Tune, so this is by far their most sort of accessible record to date. Considering Ninja Tune definitely has a pretty well-known reputation, and for having all these really interesting artists on their label, such as Bonobo from the UK, and definitely one of the best albums of the year. In terms of like its urgency, which you can hear in not only the lyrics but the vocal performances, which the vocals on this album are super wacky on this album, and I love it. Number 8, Hop Along, Bark Your Head Off, Dog. One of the best album titles of the year, in my opinion. This is an album that I'm kind of late coming to. I was actually a little hesitant to come to this album because it is on Saddle Creek, and I used to be kind of a big fan of some of the stuff on that label, but as time passed, that interest sort of faded away significantly. But because some people seem to be enjoying this record, and I heard really good things about this band, I decided to go check them out, and I'm so glad that I did, because this is definitely one of the best indie albums of the year. It's definitely a record that may take a bit to grow on you. The production's kind of rough. It's definitely a DIY lo-fi indie effort, but it definitely has some really interesting arrangements going on. Really beautiful sort of nuances of instrumentation in here, including strings, keyboards, and mandolin over some kind of peppy, sort of rough around the edges indie guitars, which I definitely hear a little bit of Slater-Kinney, a little bit of Built to Spill in this band, but I also hear plenty of their own sort of original talents, which especially Francis Quinlan's vocal delivery, which is very kind of intoxicated and powerful, and it really makes her sort of very passionate soprano really does make her lyrics that much more compelling. Which these lyrics kind of feel like little grim fairy tales, and hills and stuff like that, which I think is really cool. I think the album cover really does fit in with sort of the vibes of this album as well perfectly. So I highly recommend this album. Number 7, Mount Eerie, Now Only. Not long after Phil Elverum drops the heartbreaking concept album, A Crow Looked at Me, about the death of his wife, he follows that up less than a year later with an album that does sort of continue to address those sort of things, but feels less like a sequel to that and more kind of a progression from A Crow Looked at Me, sort of talking about his Phil Elverum's own personal experiences that he dealt with right after dealing with this really tough loss, which if you listen to A Crow Looked at Me, it really hit him hard. So if you've dealt with something like that, don't forget the tissues when you listen to that album. Listen to that album. And I love how, and it's these really beautiful vignettes that range from talking to Wise Blood and Father John Misty at a music festival about songwriting and having to play all these deaf songs in front of people that were in front of all these people at a summer festival. So it's like not the usual sort of sunny vibe that they probably got from some of the other hip bands that were playing, as well as this one that's inspired by 2 paintings by Nikolai Astrup, which of course is the title of the song as well. And the instrumentals on here sound more like fully arranged songs as opposed to stripped back acoustic songs like we have, like live drums and keyboards and electric guitars and stuff like that going on here. Not to mention the kind of harrowing, distorted bass on the track, Distortion. And instead of short fragments of heartbreak, we have these long, elongated pieces on here. So definitely a very ambitious step forward from the last album. Number 6, Neko Case, Hell On. It's been 5 years since Neko Case last dropped her previous solo record, but with Hell On, I think she really did drop probably her best record, in my opinion, since Fox Confessor Brings the Flood from 2006. This album, she drops her most accessible record to date, but definitely also one of her most emotionally intense and musically layered records to date. I mean, she brings on Björn Yttling from Peter, Bjorn, and John to produce this record, which definitely contributes to its much more sort of experimental and kind of eerie sounds, as opposed to like albums like Middle Cyclone is probably her poppiest record to date, but definitely one of her best. And this isn't the only time she's gone experimental. I mean, her previous record definitely had some pretty ambitious characteristics about it as well in the production. Like Neko Case continues to progress further and further as a lyricist, coming through with these very sort of haunting vignettes through some very beautiful vocal performances. And I love all the different guests she's brought on to help her make this album. Like, for example, Katie Lang and Laura Fears, whom she made that beautiful collaborative album with in 2016, along with people like Doug Gilliard from Guided by Voices, and even Mark Lanigan sings a duet with her on this album, which I think just sounds so beautiful. Their voices just sound incredible together on that track. Of course, I'm talking about Curse of the I-5 Corridor. Number 5, Freedom's Goblin. definitely one of the most patience testing albums of the year. I mean, this is by far his longest album to date, which I am hearing the sort of really elongated 75-minute runtime for this album. That is getting some complaints from people, but for the most part, people seem to be loving it, which, like, I personally definitely really love this album because I think Ty has pretty much come out with his magnum opus here with this album, coming out with some of his most ambitious musical ideas to date. I mean, he tries things on this album that you wouldn't think would work, and really makes them work like magic. Like, for example, I mean, heck, there's even one track that musically kind of reminds me of a Broadway musical a little bit. Not in the instruments, but rather in the tempo. But yet he really makes it sound incredible. So, like, something you think that would just be dumb and silly, he really makes work here. And he's definitely progressed as a songwriter as well. And, of course, this album has a pretty killer second half that has a really cool sort of fast pace right after the more kind of slow-paced front half of the album. And he continues to really come up with some really complicated guitar riffs that even the most sort of skilled indie guitarist can barely even come up with. Number 4, Kacey Musgraves, Golden Hour. A lot of people have said this, but this is the best country album of the year so far. Now, there's been some pretty heated debate about, is this a country album, is this not a country album, but, just let all that go and just enjoy the beauty of Kacey Musgraves' new album. She's definitely come out with by far her best set of material to date, and she's not afraid to sort of kind of bend country music a little bit by delving into genres such as like pop rock, indie rock, and even a little bit of electronic elements in there as well. I mean, I'm hearing synthesizers, and I'm even hearing vocoders on one song, which is pretty cool. She matures as a songwriter here, and she really sounds more confident than ever, so definitely a record for those of you who are just tired of all the stuff you hear on the radio about dirt roads and stuff like that. Definitely the album for you. Number 3, Car Seat Headrest, Twin Fantasy, Face to Face. This album, it is a remake of an older record, and in this case, it's Twin Fantasy from 2011, but let me say, Will Toledo and company really pulled it off with this re-recorded version of the album, making it sound more fleshed out, better produced for sure, and also it's definitely a much more sort of passionate, manic version of this album as well. I mean, Will Toledo's like very lively vocal performances really make the lyrics of this concept album that much more compelling, in my opinion. And it definitely does see, like, even though it's not a step forward from Teens of Denial, it still feels like a progression for him, not just in his vocal performances sounding more confident than ever, but also in terms of the experimentation of the album, and it has these kind of weird kind of little interludes sort of tying the whole album together that somehow really managed to work and don't come off as sounding half-baked or anything like that. Like, I think the older Twin Fantasy sounds a little too half-baked for my taste, but this new version that I think sounds incredible. Number 2, Beach House, 7. I will tell you, for a little while, this was my favorite album of the year thus far until there's this other album that I'm going to talk about after this that replaced it. But 7, I think, is by far Beach House's most layered, adventurous, and by far their most immersive album to date. I mean, Beach House with this album really made a conscious decision to create a much more sort of layered, bigger, heavier version of what they've always been. But they just made it sound so incredible here, with Sonic Boom co-producing the album with them. Victoria Legrand comes through with some of her most beautiful, like, sort of poetic lyrics that she's ever written. She definitely continues to mature as a lyricist here. And the way that they just kind of layer her vocals as like this 7-person choir out of one woman's body is just so beautiful. I mean, take Beautiful, which of course that kind of sound can especially be heard on the song L'Inconnu or something like that. It's in French, but the way that they layer her vocals on that song, outstanding. And here's my number 1 of the year so far. I reviewed this one in my previous review, Parquet Courts. Wide Awake! Definitely the best, by far the best punk album I've heard this year so far. I mean, this is an album that, this is an album that I really do think really does sort of define all the things that 2018 needs. Some urgent vocal performances, some very smart, clever, very, daring lyrical statements, as well as some fantastic riffs, and the bass lines on this album are incredible. And also, I do love how Danger Mouse produced this record, but he didn't try to make anything sound bloated or anything like that. I mean, he still let the band be themselves, be who they've always been, while still encouraging some experimentation here and there. I think songs like Violence and Back to Earth really do sort of show off his production techniques really well, and they actually have plenty of chemistry amongst Andrew Savage's lyrics, and as well as his very kind of decisive, kind of outraged vocal delivery. I mean, I've never heard this much rage and power in a Parquet Courts record before, but they definitely have dropped by far their best album to date with this new record. And let's not forget Andrew Savage's final mantra at the end of Total Football, "Bleep Tom Brady." Great line. Anyway, that's my top 16 albums of the year so far for 2018, and I'll see you for episode 202.